Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for January 27th, 2022. This is Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea. First up tonight, an article from Caitlin Johnstone, The Secrecy of Evidence. This comes to us from where does it come from? Comes to us from the Consortium News, from consortiumnews.com. Okay. The Secrecy of Evidence by Caitlin Johnstone. There is an evil Russian plot again, according to more anonymous sources. Major Western news publications are running a story about a sinister plot by the Russian government, and you may want to sit down for this. The sources of the report are anonymous, and the evidence is secret. The evidence for it is secret. The New York Times reports that according to anonymous individuals within the US and British governments, Russia is currently plotting to topple the existing government of Ukraine in some way using some method, and then somehow install a puppet government that is sympathetic to Moscow using some sort of means. What specifically those means and methods might be are not revealed to us in this very serious news report. Quote, the news communique provided few details about how Russia might go about imposing a new government on Ukraine, and did not say whether such plans were contingent on an invasion by Russian troops. The paper of record informs us. That's the New York Times. British officials familiar with the situation, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said the intent was both to head off the activation of such plans as well as to put Mr. Putin on notice that this plot has been exposed. Now, if you are hoping to be provided with some sort of evidence for these incendiary claims, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you, says Caitlin Johnson. Because get this, the journalists reporting on this story have not seen any evidence. Apparently, they're just passing on unverified government assertions made by unknown spies to their readers because they were told to, which I guess is something journalists can do now. I know, she says. I was a little surprised when I learned that too, but here it is, straight from the horse's mouth. Quote, the British communique provided no evidence to back up its assertion that Russia was plotting to overthrow the Ukrainian government, the Times reports. You will be reassured, however, to learn that despite the actual evidence of the actual Russian nefariousness being kept invisible to us, anonymous officials within the US government have reviewed the intelligence gathered by anonymous British spies for us and concluded on our behalf that the evidence is solid. Officials said they believe. In Washington, officials said they believe the British intelligence is correct. Two officials said it had been collected by the British intelligence services, the New York Times informs us. You see that? These claims about a devious Russian conspiracy have been confirmed by anonymous government operatives in both the US and the UK. That's two separate, completely unconnected governments independently verifying that these claims are true. That's called independent corroboration. Basically the same as ironclad proof, she says, gentle sirs. It does seem a little strange to me, though, that after taking great license to report anonymous government assertions without evidence, the New York Times seems to take issue with the Russian government making unevidenced claims. Quote, Russian officials have repeatedly denied any intention of launching an attack against Russia, dismissing such accusations as hysteria and claiming without providing evidence that it is the government of Kiev that is seeking to escalate tensions, write the article's authors. When the report came out, I was a bit surprised by the way uneven claims by anonymous government sources are treated as actual news stories for grown adults to read instead of empty nothing stuff to be ignored and flushed down our mental toilet tubes, as I'm sure you were too. But I did a little digging, and it turns out that this sort of thing is actually quite commonplace within Western news media institutions, like when we were told without evidence that the Russians were plotting a false flag operation in Ukraine, or like when we were told without evidence that the Russians are using high-tech ray guns to scramble the brains of US diplomats and spies, and it turned out to be baseless. Or when we were told without evidence that the Russians were playing Afghan resistance, paying Afghan resistance fighters to kill Western occupying troops, and it turned out to be false and wrong. Or like when we were told without evidence that the Russians interfered in the United States election and it monopolized all news reports and political discourse for years. Or like when we were told without evidence for years and years that Russia was about to invade Ukraine any minute now, and then it kept not happening. I'm sure this time is different, though. After all, that practice and all that trial and error, I'm sure that our trusted news media institutions have perfected their craft and are now masters at reporting the truth.
I was listening to a stream from this YouTuber, The Cavernacle, today, and he said that his take on it is that both sides should de-escalate. I feel like this speaks to the effectiveness of the propaganda, because he's somebody who's done a fair amount of research into Ukraine, but he clearly has the wrong idea, because it's not a both sides issue. It's that US imperialism, through the use of a proxy regime, is causing these escalations, and Russia is only defending itself. But I bet a lot of people are absorbing this general notion that Russia is at least some sort of guilty actor. So that makes them either apathetic, like he's essentially being, towards these war escalations, or it makes them active participants in hysteria, the demonization of Russia. These are the purposes that these obfuscations of the truth, these vague pieces of hearsay, these sensationalistic headlines serve.
Yeah, really. Really. Okay, next on the list, a world rate of profit. Important new evidence. Michael Roberts. Michael Roberts is a British Marxist economist who I like quite a bit. I don't always agree with him, but I especially agree with him on Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is the basis or the subject of Michael's article today. Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall has either been heavily criticized or ignored as being an irrelevant explanation of crises under capitalism, both theoretically and empirically. The critics are not from mainstream economics, who generally ignore the role of profit in crisis altogether. They partly come from post-Keynesian economists who look to aggregate demand as the driver of capitalist economies, not profit. But the biggest skeptics come from Marxian economists. Even though Marx considered LTRPF as the most important law of political economy, that comes from Grundis, and the underlying cause of recurrent cycles of crisis, that comes from Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 13. The skeptics argue that Marx's LTRPF is illogical and indeterminate as a theory, and the empirical support for the law is non-existent or impossible to ascertain. Instead, we must look elsewhere for a theory of crisis, either by turning to Keynes, that's Lord Milton Keynes, or amalgamating various eclectic theories like overproduction or underconsumption or financialization, or just accepting that there is no Marxist theory of crisis. In my view, these critics have been answered effectively by several authors, including myself. Thanks to better data and also determined work by various Marxist economists, too numerous to name all here, perhaps starting with Shane Maj, or that might be Mage, one of the two, Shane Maj or Mage, back in 1963, there is now overwhelming empirical evidence to back Marx's law. To begin with, this evidence was exclusively confined to US data, which was the most comprehensive. However, in the first decade of the 21st century, some Marxist economists began to compile evidence to calculate a world rate of profit. As I argued in my own first attempt to calculate a world rate of profit, this was necessary because capital is a closed economy at a global level, and capitalism had spread its tentacles to all parts of the world through the 20th century. So to find better empirical support for the law required calculating a world rate. As early as 2007, Minky et al. Made the first attempt that I know of to calculate the world rate of profit, followed by David Zachariah in 2010. My first crude attempt was in 2012, which I revised in 2017. Then came along a much more comprehensive calculation going back to 1855 for 14 countries by Esteban Maito. Some Marxist economists were vehement in their skepticism in calculating a world rate of profit, but some of us did not desist. Given new data from the Penn World Tables database available for the components of the law going back to 1950 for the economies, I made a much better calculation in 2020. But now, Marxist economists at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, led by Deepankar Basu, have delivered new evidence using data compiled by the Brazilian Marxist economist Adalmir Marchetti. Marchetti has expanded and modified the Penn World Tables developed by the Groningen Growth and Development Center into what he calls the extended Penn World Tables, the EPWT. The EPWT was first developed by Marchetti back in 2004, and I have used that database since then for my world rate of profit calculations. But Marchetti has issued an update series, EPWT 7.0, and this series can be used to calculate a world rate of profit based on a large number of countries going back to 1960. So Marx's law is emphatically vindicated empirically at a world level. On the Amherst figures, there has been a secular decline in the world rate of profit over the last 80 years of 25%, starting with a huge profitability crisis of 1966, leading to the major global slump of 1980 through 82. That was followed by the so-called neoliberal revival in profitability up to 1996. There was a plus 11% rise in global productivity. or in the global rate of profit. After that, the world economy entered what I have called a long depression, when profitability slipped back, turning up briefly in the credit boom of the 2000s and until 2004, before slipping again into the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. Since then, the world rate of profit has stagnated and was near its all-time low in 2019 before the global pandemic slump of 2020. Each post-war global slump has revived profitability, but not for long. In sum, the Basu et al. Study has added yet more empirical evidence in support of Marx's law on a world level. The evidence is overwhelming, and yet the skeptics continue to ignore it and deny its relevance. The skeptics of Marx's law of profitability are increasingly becoming like the climate change skeptics. Now, this part of this story that I have told you about here leaves out many statistical tables and a lot of facts and figures that really put the meat on this story and round it out. So I really urge everyone listening tonight to look at the link for this and go to it. And the full article has much more proof, basically, of Marx's tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and proof of the fact that, yes, indeed, the rate of profit has fallen drastically to the point now where it's just hanging on by a thread. It's not really delivering a realistic incentive to capitalists, to the capitalist class, to invest their money in profitable, productive parts of the capitalist economy. And once those parts of the capitalist economy fall and collapse, the whole damn thing collapses. Because the whole damn thing is based on productive production. They're based on producing commodities that are real things. That's the part of the economy that is not getting the investment today that it used to get, because capitalists are simply no longer incentivized to invest in the productive part of the economy. And without the productive part of the economy, the whole economy falls. Why? Because the productive part of the economy produces all the wealth that is used by all the other parts of the economy, the so-called service economy and the financial economy and so forth. All of those non-productive parts of the economy use the real things that the productive economy produces to keep the whole thing going. And without that, the whole thing does not go. The whole thing collapses. So basically, without the incentive to invest in production, the capitalist economy's days are numbered.
You know, Michael Roberts has also argued that capitalism could experience a revival in the coming decades should the world revolution be sufficiently fought off. Because he said that there are still ways for the world to be exploited, particularly in the high tech sector. And he said at one point, I I'm sure I can track down this article. He said that in the next few decades, should the current economic slump, the current long depression, start to peter out, start to go on an upward trend, then perhaps the high-tech sector could become the new primary monopoly, if it's not right now. But he said that's dependent on whether world revolution, particularly in the core imperialist countries, and that's a pretty key factor, is staved off. So it's our responsibility, despite this good sign of the weakening of capital, to organize, to combat fascism, to really carry out a plan for revolution where we are.
Yeah, well, Michael Roberts is more optimistic than I am on that. I'm not very optimistic, or I don't even know if optimistic is the right word. I am not well convinced that the capitalist system can ever recover. I'm pretty well convinced that the capitalist system is seeing its dying days now. So I don't think it can ever be recovered. The best that it can do is move into fascism so that it has the kinds of brutal repression necessary to keep things going even after the capitalist system collapses. That's my
Yes.
That's my own personal opinion. You know, I mean, Michael Roberts sees things differently than I do on that. But we'll see. We'll see. Ultimately, either way, whether it's you know, as Michael Roberts predicts or as I predict, I think it's pretty likely, or it's I'd say inevitable, that if we do not have socialist revolution in a significant part of the world, what we're going to have is a move into world fascism.
Yeah, for most of the world.
Yeah, and that's whether I'm right or whether Robert Michaels is right, because whether the capitalist system does revive itself or not, I personally think that the capitalist system needs fascism to go on from here. It cannot go on from here without it. So anyway, let's look to see what the next article on our list is. Keep this moving on. We're already halfway through here, or a half an hour through anyway. Number 3, solution to global inequality is socialism. Now, this is an editorial. It comes from the Workers' World Party. And the editorial basically is saying that, well, why don't I just move into it and you'll see for yourself. Around the globe, billions of people are suffering incredible losses resulting from capitalism's inability to and refusal to seriously address the COVID-19 panic. Millions have lost lives or loved ones. Families are houseless. Workers have been forced to choose between risking their health at minimum wage jobs and feeding their families, with inflation steadily driving up the costs of food and other basic necessities. The burden has been heaviest on the global South, on people of color, on people with disabilities, on gig economy workers, and on women, many of whom were forced to leave their jobs for lack of childcare and other essential support. Yet for 10 white men, The panic has brought windfall profits of epic proportions. Their collective wealth has more than doubled during the COVID-19 pandemic, growing to $1.5 trillion, while inequality exacerbated by the panic resulted in the deaths of at least 21,000 people globally each day, roughly one person every 4 seconds. These ultra billionaires now grow collectively richer by 1.2 billion with each passing day. These statistics were released in a report by Oxfam International in early January. Billionaires have had a terrific pandemic, stated Oxfam International's executive director, Gabrielle Butcher. Central banks pumped trillions of dollars into financial markets to save the economy. Yet much of that has ended up lining the pockets of billionaires riding a stock market boom. According to Oxfam, and we fully concur, an economic system that allows a handful of individuals to mass such vast fortunes while billions go hungry and without proper medical care during a pandemic is an overt act of economic violence aimed at huge swaths of humanity. Where we differ with Oxfam is in the solution. Oxfam calls for a wealth tax as a way to redistribute wealth. While there's nothing wrong with this, it doesn't address the systemic problem. The super billionaires will do what they always do, pass the costs of high taxes on to the consumers through price increases and to workers through decreased wages and benefits. The wealth of these 10 CEOs, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Elon Musk from Telsa, Bill Gates from Microsoft, Larry Page from Google, Sergey Brin from Google, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, Stephen Ballmer from Microsoft, Warren Buffett from Berkshire Hathaway, Larry Ellison from Oracle, and French businessman Bernard Arnault wasn't based on their tax avoidance, although it contributed. The real source of their wealth stems from their super exploitation of the collective labor of their workers. It is highly unlikely that Jeff Bezos ever hoisted a heavy box of one of his Amazon warehouses, in competition with a robot, or that Elon Musk ever worked on a Telsa assembly line. Yet they have both grown super rich exploiting the labor of workers who do those jobs. Take back the wealth we've produced, they say. Wealth redistribution only comes from organized workers taking back the wealth they collectively created, wealth stolen from them by the bosses. While a wealth tax should stay on the table, President Joe Biden signing an executive order to pass the Protecting the Right to Organize Act would go a lot further in addressing income equality. The solution needed right now is broad and intense support for unionizing efforts by workers at Amazon, Starbucks, and many other corporations, large and small. Workers need to demand free health care, cancellation of student loan debt, a universal, global, livable minimum wage, the guaranteed right to unionize, and much more. Workers' World Party supports the fights for all these traditional demands. But to truly address income equality, our fight must be for socialism, under which the means of the production are collectively owned by the workers and oppressed. where these uber wealthy CEOs would actually have to do an honest day's work for once in their lives. I agree with Workers' World Party 100% on this. As I always say, socialist revolution is the only solution.
And we need to make it clear to the masses that socialist revolution does not mean voting in social democrats or democratic socialists, as they call themselves. AOC's tax the rich dress was ridiculed partly for this reason. Remember that display? It was the AOC at an event with a dress that said "tax the rich,"
right?
And it was reductive.
Yeah, AOC is pushing the same garbage as Oxfam is. That taxes are the solution. No, taxes under capitalism are not the solution. They will not solve the basic problems. Only socialist revolution will do that. And we should also point out, number one, we invite all the social democrats and democratic socialists, as they call themselves, to join us in real revolution. And I think a lot of young social democrats and democratic socialists will do that. I have no doubt of that. We welcome you with open arms. What we don't welcome is the solutions by people like AOC and Bernie Sanders and such that basically keep us corralled in the death grip, in the strangulation death grip of capitalism, especially a dying capitalist system. That's what we don't agree with. So, social democrats, yes, you are welcome. Join us revolutionaries in fighting for the real socialist revolution. And I want to point out too, the socialist revolution, we're not calling for a violent overthrow of the government. What we're calling for is a nonviolent overthrow of the capitalist class, an overthrow of the state that the capitalist class creates. Any violence at all in this socialist revolution or any socialist revolution, in ours or any others, always comes from the capitalist class. We have to be ready for that. We have to be ready for their violence. And they will be violent. They are a violent, sick, war criminal, crimes against humanity class that only knows violence. So they will bring violence, but it will not come from us. We do not start violence. We only defend ourselves. But the socialist revolution, what we're talking about is not a violent overthrow. It's not a war that we create. It's simply workers putting down the tools of production and demanding a change in government and in state that will allow for more reasonable solutions to our problems, that will put the working class in the driver's seat, put the working class into the role of ruling class in this country and really throughout the world is what we're hoping for, what we're looking for. So, anything else on that?
No.
Okay, next on the list, the class conflict intensifies. As the class conflict intensifies, capitalism is pushed into the corner by Rainer Shea. Take it away, Rainer.
There's this dynamic that is unfolding as the rate of profit continues to fall. And you mentioned how the denial of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is analogous to climate change denial, global warming denial. And as for the impacts of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall that these deniers are saying won't happen, these impacts are the capitalist crises that we're witnessing all around us every single day. Fascist violence, the escalation of geopolitical tensions as U.S. imperialism lashes out in desperation because it's capitalism in danger. The stagnation and decline of wages, decline of living standards, consequentially, the increased vulnerability of capitalist societies to crises like the pandemic. And the pandemic we're experiencing now will be far from the worst type of crisis that we're going to experience this century. These are the kinds of destabilizing, humanity endangering events that are going to continue to get more severe as the tendency of default continues, because the capitalists are going to keep reacting to this decline by carrying out ever more desperate measures, whether these measures are military adventurism, greater investment in the militarized police state, increased austerity, privatization, wage cuts, deregulation. All of these extremely destabilizing, dangerous factors are getting cranked up because our society is stuck in this collapsing system, and the ruling class is lashing out.
7 myths about January 6th from the Black Agenda report. This article is, well, it's about last year, January 6th, and the brouhaha that the Democrat Party is making out of it. 7 myths about the January 6th Capitol building incident from Barr. The events of January 6, 2021 at the Capitol have been discussed and written about endlessly, but without much useful analysis. The Democrats have used Trump supporters' actions to their political advantage, obscuring betrayals of their own voters. After over a year of incessant publicity, the Capitol building incident of January 6, 2021 has taken on mythic proportions. While all myths are prone to hyperbole, not all are entirely false, as the following account relates. January 6 was not an attempted coup. According to Noam Chomsky, that it was an attempted coup is not in question, likening the incident to Hitler's failed beer hall push of 1923. However, after storming the Capitol building and taking selfies, the demonstrators simply left after a few hours. Their attempt to influence the electoral process by disruption did not and could not have led to a seizure of state power. Journalist Glenn Greenwald points out, after a full year of Democrat-led DOJ, that's Department of Justice, conducting what is heralded as the most expansive federal law enforcement investigation in the U.S. history, have been charged with inciting insurrection, sedition, treason, or conspiracy to overthrow the government. Then on January 13th, The government charged 11 with seditious conspiracy, which, according to the New York Times, is difficult to prove. Greenwald continues. The Department of Homeland Security issued at least 6 separate heightened threat warnings last year, not a single one of which materialized. There were no violent protests in Washington, D.C. or in the state capitals on Inauguration Day. No violent protests materialized the week after Biden's inauguration. Each time such a warning was issued, cable outlets and liberal newspapers breathlessly reported them, ensuring fear levels remained high. What did happen is that a sitting president unprecedentedly called for a march on the Capitol to contest an election, signifying a breakdown of bourgeois political norms. Quite unlike Al Gore, who took a hit for the elite political stability rather than contest the 2000 presidential election, Trump flagrantly broke the rules of orderly succession. January 6th ranks with Pearl Harbor and the terrorist attacks on 9/11. That's some of the claims that the right wing is making. Vice President Kamala Harris solemnly proclaimed, certain dates echo through history when our democracy comes under assault. December 7th, 1941, September 11th, 2001, and January 6th, 2021. According to the U.S. Senate report, 7 fatalities are attributed to January 6th. 1 person was fatally shot by the police, 1 succumbed to an overdose of amphetamine, and 2 others died of natural causes. All were Trump supporters. In the days that followed, Officer Brian Sicknick died of natural causes, according to the coroner's report, contrary to false news that his passing was due to injuries on January 6th. 2 other police officers died of suicide. In contrast, 2,390 perished in Pearl Harbor, 2,977 on 9/11. The former marked the beginning of active U.S. military engagement in World War II, which took an estimated 70 to 85 million people. The latter sparked the War on Terror, claiming an estimated 1.3 to 2 million casualties. Part of the perception of growing white supremacy is a commendable increased awareness and reporting of this national blight and growing movement in opposition. A KKK bombing in the late 1960s of an historically Black college in Mississippi, where I was a junior faculty, did not even get into the news. Earlier this month, 7 historically Black colleges received bomb threats, and that made national headlines. The successes of anti-racist efforts like the Black Lives Matter movement, which mounted the largest mass demonstrations in U.S. history, should be recognized. It also should be recognized that white supremacy didn't originate with Trump, nor will it end with his departure, but is deeply embedded in the national DNA. Ask a Native American whose ancestral lands were expropriated by European settlers as part of a brutal process of displacement and extermination. Ask an African American whose forebears were brought here as chattel slavery slaves, and upon whose labor much of the wealth of the nation was accumulated. Ask a Japanese American about the internment of West Coast Japanese, which was the project of the arguably most liberal president in U.S. history. As Jamu Baraka of the Black Alliance for Peace comments, fascism is nothing new for us, a colonized people, a people who have been enslaved. It has typically been called fascism only when white people do certain things to other white people.
Uh-huh. Oh, so that's a list. Well, this certainly speaks to the exceptionalism that is involved with a lot of analyses of fascism, because fascism, as you explained, is really just colonialism, imperialism come home. The kinds of alarmist statements that have been put out about January 6th and what it means in historical terms. Sure, it was a serious propaganda victory for fascism. It was a terrorist attack, but the new administration and other facets of the liberal establishment have blown it out of proportion in these ways to keep political analysis myopic, to distract from the reality that we are a settler colonial country that is the core of global imperialism, the primary arbiter of imperialist violence worldwide, and the kinds of violence that we're experiencing right now as fascism rises is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the fascism that, in terms of the violence that imperialism has been responsible for centuries and is responsible for continuously. There was this horrific story I saw a few days ago about how the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia recently shut down Yemen's internet so that they could more effectively carry out massacres of civilians. These are the kinds of tactics that our government is using right now. That should be what we're primarily focused on, in addition to, well, paying attention to this rising fascist threat, which is serious. As you said, we need to prepare to defend ourselves.
Yes,
from
yes.
it when it's more outward.
Right. Right. Next on the list, Christian nationalism and the foundations for right-wing terror.
The capitalist class is increasingly rolling out the red carpet, accommodating the more fringe right-wing elements, the Christian nationalists, the weird cults in places like Taiwan, where U.S. is carrying out these geopolitical machinations. I'm talking about Adrian Zenz, the far-right Christian fundamentalist who has been spreading lies about supposed atrocities committed by the Chinese government to further his aims of winning what he sees as an apocalyptic war for the redemption of the human race and the return of Christ. I'm talking about Falun Gong, the cult that's primarily based in Taiwan, which has a parallel apocalyptic religious ideology, and in order to bring its desired apocalypse forth, has been putting forth lies about China being to blame for the pandemic. They went so far in their propaganda campaign a couple of years ago when the pandemic was exploding in the United States that free copies of their China pandemic newspaper edition to everyone in the US they could find. They sent a copy to my doorstep. They sent it to millions, seemingly. That's how obsessed they are with whipping up Americans into a racist, anti-Chinese frenzy. And it's the foundations for a right-wing terror campaign. That's what these propaganda efforts are carrying out. They're legitimizing some really extreme, dangerous elements whose aims are analogous to those of the political faction which took power in Indonesia, 1965. The fascists who killed hundreds of thousands of people when they took power in a military coup out in a fanatical effort to suppress communism.
Yeah. And murdered more than 500,000 people. One of the greatest mass murderers of the 20th century. I'll also point out the Falun Gong's newspaper is free to everybody all the time. So they give it away for free. I used to see it all over the place. When I lived in Washington, D.C., every subway stop had one of their, free paper machines. It was all over the place. So, yeah. You really made me laugh when the guy, is serious about starting a apocalyptic war, to save humanity from sin or some nonsense. It's really amazing that there's anybody who believes that shit. But there are nuts out there. And these people are certainly in the category of nuts. Last but not least, U.S. hands off Ukraine. And this is another Workers' World Party editorial. I've got two things from Workers' World Party today. They were they were pretty good this week. Anyway, by ordering preparations to send 5,000 more U.S. troops to countries near the Russian border January 23rd, President Joe Biden stepped up the risk of a war between the world's two most powerful nuclear-armed states. Once again, U.S. imperialism has threatened a new military adventure in pursuit of domination, this time with a major military power. Workers' World calls upon all anti-imperialist and anti-war forces in the United States and Western Europe to protest Washington's war threats and demand that the U.S. and all NATO forces withdraw from Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. During the weeks leading up to Biden's order, U.S. corporate media has led off in its international news with reports of impending war in Ukraine. President Joe Biden has accused Russia of planning an invasion, and Britain has accused Russia of planning a coup in Kiev, Ukraine's capital, to install a Russia-friendly regime. The Russian government denies both charges. The US-based corporate media, from the New York Times and NPR to Fox News, accused Vladimir Putin, the Vladimir Putin government of Russia, of planning aggression against Ukraine and fomenting war. This coordinated anti-Russia campaign is aimed at justifying war preparations against Russia and to force Washington's European allies to line up behind U.S. aggression. Similar campaigns, all lies, accompanied the war buildups against the former Yugoslavia in 1999, Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, and Libya and Syria in 2011. The propaganda campaigns are an essential part of every imperialist war. Whatever decisions have already been made by the Pentagon, the CIA, and the rest of the US foreign policy establishment, the level of danger is high enough that all anti-imperialist and anti-war forces in the US and Europe should be on high alert, to protest this latest war drive. NATO should be dissolved. NATO should have been dissolved. Instead, the US adapted NATO, which it dominated, into an instrument of military intervention in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even in Africa and throughout Central and Western Asia. Since 1990, NATO has nearly doubled its membership from 16 members to 30 in 2001. The new members are former Warsaw Pact members and former Soviet republics. And NATO has put Ukraine and Georgia, states bordering Russia, on its wish list as future members. NATO already has bases within a short striking distance of Russia. Italy, as a founding NATO member, has supersonic nuclear capable F-35 bombers within half an hour of Moscow. The Russian government interpreted these US moves as an existential threat. Russian President Putin said, "You're on our doorstep. We didn't come to you." Putin was correct. He proposed that NATO withdraw from all the countries near Russia and that there be no place in NATO for Ukraine. Workers' World demands US hands off Ukraine, withdraw US troops and weapons from Europe, and put an end to the NATO alliance.
Ukraine's government has said that Russia does not, in fact, plan to invade because that would be far too costly. Ukraine claims that Russia wants to destabilize Ukraine, which could mean pretty much anything. It's basically a nothing statement because they could now easily point to anything at all, like somebody in Ukraine somewhere made an off-color comment and say, "See, Russia is destabilizing us." But regardless of whether that's true, now that Ukraine itself has said that Russia doesn't plan to invade, there's clearly no point in the U.S. sending any forces there. What's the U.S. Trying to do besides instigate a conflict itself? The U.S. is the clear aggressor in this situation, objectively.
Yeah, the U.S. already has many forces in Ukraine, mostly training forces, training the Ukrainian, the fascist Ukrainian government's army. But they are saying that they're going to send 5,000 more. So this isn't just 5,000. This is 5,000 plus the 20, 30, probably 40,000 plus CIA operatives and so forth. So it's a lot bigger than 5,000. I just wanted to point that out to the people. So, yeah. Well, that's it for tonight. We've had fun. We want to first of all, thank Rainer for everything you do to help put this show together, and thank all the viewers and listeners out there for tuning in. And please join us again next week when we'll have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you all a sweet adieu.